There are precisely two things I knew for sure that Thursday morning. 1. The mailman had once again ignored the "Do Not Bend" sticker on my vintage car magazine envelope. And 2. Someone, God help us, had planted a pink plastic flamingo in my yard. Now, our neighborhood is one of those where folks still wave from their driveways and pretend they don't Google each other's property values every couple months. So naturally, a flamingo, especially a flamingo in my perfectly rectangular, thoroughly fertilized front lawn, was bound to get noticed. I stared at it for a solid minute, not just because it clashed with the mulch, which it did, but because of what was tied around its neck, a ribbon, bright green, with tiny sunflowers on it. Pamela hated sunflowers, called them confused weeds in party dresses. I married her anyway. Now, this flamingo had no business being there. I hadn't planted it. Pamela hadn't mentioned any spontaneous purchases from whatever catalog she read in bed with a pin tucked behind her ear. And our neighbor Greg wouldn't dare pull a prank, not after the unfortunate incident with the inflatable Santa and the mistaken 911 call. So I did what any sane man in a good marriage would do. I plucked it from the ground, shook the dirt from its metal legs, and carried it into the kitchen like a man returning from battle with a confused bird. Pamela was in her usual morning position, robe, coffee, crossword puzzle half filled with wildly confident guesses. She looked up, raised one eyebrow, and said the 4 words that would later echo in my brain like an off-key jingle. "Oh, you found it. Found it? Found it?" This wasn't some lost sock from the dryer abyss. It was a 2-foot neon pink plastic bird with a sunflower bow tie. Care to elaborate? I asked, setting it gently on the kitchen counter, as if it might explode or sing. Pamela sipped her coffee like we were discussing grocery store coupons. "It's a thing. You wouldn't get it. Try me. It's part of a game." "A game involving decorative poultry?" Pamela rolled her eyes. "Stephen, everything doesn't have to make sense to you." She went back to her crossword, like the flamingo, and I didn't just share a profound moment of betrayal together. Now here's the thing. I wouldn't call myself nosy, but I'm what you might refer to as curiosity-prone. And I wasn't about to let the flamingo incident die quietly. Later that day, while Pamela was meeting with her book club, a mysterious group of women I had only ever seen in blurry photos and once from a distance at an estate sale, I did a bit of recon. Subtle, gentlemanly, dignified recon. By that I mean, I drove to the local hardware store where I knew Jerry worked. Jerry is a man with an admirable collection of lawn ornaments and a running feud with the city council about individual aesthetic expression. He saw me walk in with the flamingo and whistled like I'd brought in a prize trout. "Well, I'll be. Where'd you dig up one of those? You recognize it?" Jerry gave it a once-over. "That's no ordinary flamingo. That there's from the Sunset set. Limited edition. Only 50 sold in the entire county. Got mine bolted into concrete." The Sunset set. My head spun. I was out of my league. Where do people get them? He leaned on the counter like he was about to tell me how to unlock a secret door in a video game. "You gotta be invited. Or, you gotta be sleeping with someone who was." And just like that, my stomach dropped. Now, I'll admit, my marriage wasn't burning with passion or anything cinematic. But we had a rhythm. I made pancakes on Sunday, Pamela overwatered the houseplants. We both pretended not to hate each other's in-laws. That's love in year 11. But flamingos? Flamingos opened a whole new chapter. I didn't confront her right away. I'm a patient man. I once watched an entire 3-part documentary on paint drying techniques because I didn't want to hurt a coworker's feelings. But this needed a slow approach. So I waited until Saturday. I told Pamela I was heading to Lowe's. She barely looked up from her phone, which I had recently discovered she typed on like she was defusing a bomb, quick, urgent, and secretive. Instead, I drove to my cousin's place, where we set up what I'll call a non-invasive observational strategy, which is code for sitting in his car eating Chex Mix while watching my own driveway. At precisely 3:27 p.m., a man pulled up in a vintage red El Camino. He got out with all the confidence of someone who had definitely never read a single homeowners association rule in his life. He carried another flamingo. My flamingo had a friend. I watched as he strutted across my lawn, past the hydrangeas I'd fought aphids for, and stuck the second flamingo right next to the first. He even adjusted their little sunflower bows to face each other. Then he took a selfie with them. I was still processing this when Pamela opened the front door in what I can only describe as her leisure hosting outfit, flowy pants, glass of something cold in hand, and the kind of smile you usually reserve for hotel check-ins and someone else's dog. They hugged. I swear on my granddad's lawnmower, they hugged. She didn't look like someone whose husband was just at Lowe's. She looked like someone who had a collection of plastic birds and secrets. I didn't stick around for the whole scene. My cousin, who had been unusually quiet, which meant he was enjoying this more than he should, patted my shoulder and said, "Well, you always said you wanted something exciting to happen." I went home late that night. Pamela was already in bed, pretending to read some crime novel. I sat on the edge of the mattress and said, casually, "So, any flamingos visit today?" She didn't blink, just turned a page and muttered, "Must have missed it." That was when I knew. No lipstick on a collar, no text message caught over her shoulder. Just one flamingo, and then two. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. The pink birds were multiplying, and with them, the truth. 3 days after the flamingo introduction ceremony, the pink duo still stood proudly on our lawn, forming a tiny, unapologetic committee of judgment. Every time I glanced out the living room window, they stared back, slightly tilted to the left, like they knew what I didn't. Pamela, for her part, acted like they'd always been there, like we'd just forgotten our shared enthusiasm for molded polyethylene decor. She even mentioned maybe getting a third one, for symmetry. I said nothing and decided it was time to perform what I'd been putting off, a completely accidental, deeply strategic investigation. Now, let me be clear. I didn't rummage. I simply explored, carefully, like a man checking for expired ketchup in the fridge and somehow ending up reading every label on every bottle, just in case one had a hidden message. It began in the garage. Pamela rarely touched the garage, except when she needed to yell something across the driveway while holding a tote bag the size of a passenger seat. I opened the side cabinets, the ones labeled holiday stuff, though the holidays never specified which ones. Inside, old tinsel, a terrifying papier-mâché leprechaun, and, oddly, a box marked craft supplies. Pamela didn't do crafts. She once burned a potholder trying to glue rhinestones onto it. So naturally, I opened it. Inside were several folders. Not arts and crafts folders, not glitter and glue. These were business folders, the kind that held documents with serious, grown-up fonts. One of them had a label, Yard Sale Fund. We hadn't had a yard sale in 2 years. Curiosity, meet opportunity. I opened the folder. Receipts. Neatly stapled. Color-coded highlights. One in particular jumped out. It was from a storage unit company downtown. Not under Pamela's name. The name said Jonathan Leckie. Jonathan Leckie was not a name I recognized, and I pride myself on remembering the names of everyone within a 3-mile radius who's ever tried to sell me something or misdelivered a package. I took a photo of the receipt with my phone. I'd already crossed the line into mild espionage, might as well keep a souvenir. Next step was simple. Research. In the age of internet wizards and people oversharing online, it took all of 9 minutes to find out that Jonathan Leckie was a local creative organizer, which is a fancy way of saying he rearranged people's junk for money and posted time-lapse videos of it on social media, complete with perky background music. And wouldn't you know it, Jonathan had posted a new video that morning. Caption: sunshine, fresh space, and one very charming client. You know who you are. Smirking face, hashtag organizing life, hashtag minimalism, hashtag create a chaos. I clicked the video. There, in the grainy, overly filtered footage, was our storage unit. Ours. The old bookshelf I'd inherited from my aunt. Right there. The busted lamp we kept, just in case. Center stage. And then, walking past the camera with a smirk like she was on a reality show none of us asked for, was Pamela. Wearing sunglasses indoors, holding a clipboard, and pointing like she was directing a musical about old furniture. My wife, who told me last week she didn't have time to sort the garage because she was deeply overwhelmed. There she was, managing a private inventory session with a man who looked like he ironed his t-shirts and used words like vision board, unironically. I paused the video, zoomed in. On the clipboard was a sticker that read the flamingo list. Well, at this point, any sane person might confront their spouse directly. But I had reached a point beyond sanity, past rational confrontation, and into the far more satisfying territory of passive-aggressive strategy. That night, I mentioned, casually, over laundry, I was thinking we should finally clear out that storage unit. Pamela didn't even look up from folding. Which one? Which one? We owned one storage unit. Or so I thought. The one on Gable Street, I said, as if I hadn't spent 3 hours cross-referencing digital breadcrumbs like a suburban detective. She paused. Just for a second, then shrugged. Might be a little full right now. I'll take care of it eventually. I could help. No. It's mostly my stuff. You know, her stuff. The shelf that used to hold my middle school yearbooks and the lamp I broke during an overly enthusiastic attempt at assembling IKEA furniture. I said nothing more. Just smiled like someone who wasn't internally keeping track of every sentence for later analysis. 2 days later, I drove by the storage place. Parked across the street. Watched Jonathan and Pamela, yes, again, standing beside a bright orange bin labeled donations. They laughed. She tapped his arm. He leaned toward her and said something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need subtitles. This time, she had a clipboard and a walkie-talkie. Now let me pause here and say, I'm not opposed to my wife having friends, or even co-conspirators in the great game of suburban clutter control. But walkie-talkies? That was either highly unnecessary or very specific. Later that night, I printed a screenshot of the video, just the part where she walks past the camera like she's inspecting an art gallery of my forgotten possessions, and taped it to the refrigerator. Underneath, I wrote, "New career in interior espionage? Let's talk." She saw it the next morning. Didn't say a word. Just took it down, crumpled it, and threw it away with the casualness of someone who'd done it before. Then she poured her coffee and asked if I wanted the last of the French vanilla creamer, which she knows I hate. And just like that, our war became one of smiles and subtle threats. I bought a flamingo of my own, planted it next to hers. No sunflower bell, just a little sign that read, "I see you." The next morning, it was gone. In its place, a note tucked into the mailbox and signed, "Stephen, some things are better left in storage. F." The handwriting wasn't Pamela's. It also wasn't not Pamela's. So now, I'm here, with a list of receipts, a time-stamped video, and a growing collection of flamingos in my basement. This isn't paranoia. This is research. And I have a theory. But before I get to that, I've got a flamingo to return. On Tuesday afternoon, Pamela told me she was attending a personal development workshop. The phrase made me uncomfortable in the way, rebooting the router, used to when she said it with the remote in her hand instead. My wife, who once declared she'd never sit in a folding chair for anything that didn't involve a cash prize or cake, had now become someone who voluntarily sat through PowerPoints with clip art graphics of brain diagrams. I asked where it was. She said downtown, in that building near the candle supply place, which was specific and vague at the same time. Very on brand. She even offered, with great emphasis, that partners weren't allowed. I nodded like someone who respected boundaries, then immediately opened a private browser tab and searched for every self-help, motivational, or corporate mumbo-jumbo seminar within a 10-mile radius of candle smells and confusing office parks. That's how I found it. The Workshop for Strategic Separations. It was billed as a transitional guidance experience for individuals entering new phases of interpersonal alignment, which is a long, abstract way of saying people trying to break up with someone but wanting to look like the bigger person. There were 2 time slots. One of them, naturally, coincided with Pamela's weekly book club, which I now assumed involved fewer literary discussions and more strategic logistics. It was listed under the name of its lead facilitator, Jonathan Leckie. Well, the following day, I rearranged my schedule with a precision NASA would have envied. Called in a favor at work, pretended the water heater was making that noise again, and parked myself across the street from the address an hour before anything started. The building looked like a place where bad startups went to give their last TED Talk. Inside, I saw a few people wandering in with folders, yoga mats, and the kind of reusable water bottles that have slogans like "Manifest It" and "Hydrate to Dominate." At exactly 5:58 p.m., Pamela walked in. She wasn't alone. With her was Jonathan. No clipboard this time. Instead, he had a messenger bag and the unmistakable look of someone who considered himself a thought leader because he once read a Brené Brown quote on a mug. I sat in the car, entirely still, feeling like I was watching a dress rehearsal for a breakup that hadn't been announced yet. On the website, there was a free downloadable PDF, Strategic Separation, a roadmap to empowered exit. I downloaded it. I'm not proud of that, but I also didn't ask for any of this, so I consider us even. It included helpful checklists. Have you created an emotional transition zone? Have you tested your partner's reaction to subtle withdrawal cues? Have you established a network of post-relationship support figures, e.g., facilitators, colleagues, empathetic baristas? Under that, a sample script. I'm not leaving you. I'm stepping into me. I read it twice. Once to process the audacity, and a second time to mentally prepare myself for the moment Pamela said it out loud with her I read one article on psychology, and now I'm qualified to explain your childhood trauma tone. By Friday, the flamingos were gone. No warning, no fanfare. Just disappeared. Their absence felt louder than their presence, like someone had taken down a billboard in the middle of the night. Pamela didn't mention it. Neither did I. She did, however, casually suggest I consider spending time alone this weekend, because she needed the house clear to get some clarity. I asked if she was painting. She blinked. What? You said you needed the house clear for clarity. I assumed you were painting something or exorcising something. Or starting an indoor wind farm. She told me I was being sarcastic again. I told her it was hereditary. That Saturday, I did not leave the house. I stayed. Quietly. Conveniently. In the attic. I wasn't spying. I was participating in the architectural appreciation of our 1970s insulation. And if that happened to align with Pamela hosting a meeting downstairs with Jonathan and two people I could only describe as aggressively earnest, well, that's just geography. I couldn't make out everything they said, but I heard phrases. Phrases no one uses during normal human conversations. Liberation through structure. Timeline of release. Soft boundary rehearsal. And, my personal favorite, partner repositioning strategies. When they left, I stayed up there for another hour. Not out of fear. Out of strategic silence. Pamela came up later, holding a basket of laundry. She didn't expect to see me sitting on the floor reading a book about garden sheds I found behind the water heater. Oh, you're here. I live here, I said, politely. I thought you were at Steve's. Steve and I are in a trial separation. He said he needed space. She blinked, unsure if I was serious, and left without further questions. Which is fair, because there were none she was prepared to answer. On Sunday, she gave me a printed list, titled Transition Guidelines. It wasn't a divorce letter. It was instructions. Sections included preferred lighting during reflective hours, boundaries for shared space with color-coded zones, agreed-upon playlist vetoes, rules for third-party visitors, her term, not mine. There was even a clause about humming in the kitchen being considered emotional obstruction. I read it in silence, then folded it in half, handed it back, and asked if this meant I'd need to RSVP to use the bathroom. She said, that's not constructive. I said, neither are half your throw pillows, but we're still keeping them. Pamela exhaled in that way people do when they've already decided they're the evolved one. Then, that evening, something changed. I received an email. Not a long one. No subject. Just one line and an attachment. The line read, thought you might want to see this. The attachment? A flyer. An early version of the workshop flyer, still saved with its original file name, breakup_beta_test_Pamela1.pdf. The author field? Created by Pamela Franklin. And in the bottom right corner, a small note in italicized font. Special thanks to Pamela for piloting our first domestic implementation. #Flamingo Project. On Monday, Pamela scheduled a meeting with me in our own living room. She didn't call it a conversation or a talk. It was a meeting. There was a folded agenda sheet with bullet points and what she referred to as mutual alignment objectives. I didn't ask what that meant because I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. She wore glasses she didn't need, the kind people put on when they want to look like they're too busy for nonsense. She also brought a clipboard, which has lately become her favorite accessory since she started treating our marriage like a moderately struggling nonprofit. I sat down across from her on the couch, which she had repositioned into a more open seating format the night before. Translation. Now I sit where the sun hits my face directly and she gets the side near the outlet. She began the meeting by thanking me for making space emotionally and spatially. I responded by blinking. Then she unfolded a trifold brochure with our Wi-Fi password written in calligraphy on the back. I knew because I wrote it. This, she said, is from the Committee for Lifestyle Reassessment. I asked if the committee had a logo yet. She didn't answer. Pamela explained very seriously that she had volunteered to pilot a case study on transitional domestic realignment, which sounded like a housing market crash disguised as a marriage. According to her, we were going to try a living autonomy trial. A LAT. I asked if the acronym was chosen because alone was too obvious. Again, no answer. She continued reading. The LAT would consist of 3 phases: physical decentralization, emotional defragmentation, and post-intimacy neutrality. I tried to follow along, but at some point between emotional and neutrality, I began to focus on the fact that one of the bullet points said, optional bed zoning based on mental cycles. I asked her if mental cycles were related to moon phases or her tendency to sort people into personality types based on how they react to minor inconveniences. She told me I was being resistant to evolution. I told her I'd evolved enough when I started using a laundry basket. She slid me a printed sheet titled Trial Living Adjustments. It included a map of our house with different colored stickers marking what she referred to as emotionally optimal usage areas. My former reading nook was now a reflection and release spot. The laundry room was a zone of domestic non-attribution. I wasn't sure what that meant, but based on the chart, I was allowed to breathe in there but not speak. Then she gave me the new calendar. She had scheduled one-on-one debrief meetings with Jonathan Leckie every Tuesday at 6:15 p.m. She labeled them as individual realignment consultations. Underneath, in fine print, please honor this sacred time. I asked if he was billing us by the vowel. Pamela reminded me that Jonathan was a facilitator, not a therapist. I reminded her that he also sold a line of linen storage baskets with inspirational quotes and had once used the term emotional composting in public. We stared at each other for a moment. Her face had that expression people wear when they believe they're the one with the clarity. I must have looked like I was trying to guess the answer to a riddle I didn't want to solve. The next morning, she brought in a whiteboard. Not a small one. A full-sized rolling whiteboard, like you'd see in a boardroom where someone's trying to justify cutting your department. She said it was to track the stages of transition. It had 4 columns. Observations, reflections, adjustments, celebrations. Under observations, she wrote, Stephen continues sarcasm despite clear feedback. Under reflections, she added, his resistance may be linked to inherited avoidance patterns. Under adjustments, she noted, offer more neutral language for difficult topics. Under celebrations, it remained blank. I asked if we could start celebrating when the whiteboard left the house. She wrote that under observations, by Thursday, things escalated. Not loudly, not emotionally, strategically. Pamela invited 3 people over. She called it a support pod. I called it a panel of people who suddenly knew more about our marriage than I did. There was a woman named Dana who wore a necklace with a tiny fork on it. She said it reminded her to consume life with intention. There was a guy named Colin who brought his own coasters and said he didn't believe in couches. And finally, there was Tracy, who was introduced as Pamela's boundary consultant. Tracy spoke only in questions. Everything was phrased as a prompt. How does this dynamic serve you? Where are your personal exits? What's hiding beneath your schedule? When she asked me if I felt witnessed, I said, I feel like I'm on trial in a court where the judge teaches yoga and the jury speaks exclusively in affirmations. Tracy smiled like she'd just diagnosed me with something exotic. The support pod stayed for 90 minutes. They didn't eat anything. They just rearranged my living room, lit a candle I wasn't allowed to blow out, and left behind a sheet of paper titled Cooperative Separation Indicators. The sheet included the following items. Avoiding sarcasm during household negotiations. Speaking from your center. Reframing attachment as gratitude for experience. Accepting the fluidity of roles within cohabitation. I wrote my own version and taped it to the fridge. Laundry should remain in baskets. If you light a candle, put it out. The phrase, stepping into me, will be fined $5 per use. The couch stays. That night, Pamela said, you're not taking this seriously. I said, I take the couch very seriously. On Saturday, a package arrived. I opened it. Inside, a sweatshirt that said, I am my own home. No return address. Just a note that read, you are loved. Step into yourself. J. I added it to the drawer labeled Future Evidence. And I waited. Because at this point, Pamela had constructed a full ideological scaffolding for her exit. She hadn't left, but she'd already moved all the furniture in her head. And I was just the guy still trying to find out what happened to the flamingos. There was a spreadsheet on the dining table titled Household Transparency Feedback Loop. Pamela said it would help us process closure with conscious structure. I said it looked like a customer satisfaction form from a dental clinic that served green juice. She ignored that and handed me a pen that said, breathe, then speak. It had a floral grip and clicked in reverse. I was assigned column B, rows 4 through 19. Each row was labeled with helpful categories like passive deflection, tone policing, and symbolic resistance. I asked if this was a review of my performance or the outline of a very experimental play. She blinked and underlined tone policing. Column A had her comments from the past 2 weeks. Apparently, my use of the phrase, "Oh, we're doing that now," was a recurring emotional detour. Also, I was recycling my sarcasm too often. That one stung a little. I like to think I keep it fresh. At the bottom, she'd added, "Stephen may be operating from a closed loop of narrative stasis." I wrote back, "Pamela may be operating from a closed loop of TEDx talks in air quotes." She didn't respond, but she did pull out another form. This one was titled Closing Conversation Worksheet. It had multiple choice questions. How would you describe your current emotional state? A. Composed. B. Confused. C. Expired. D. Other. Underscore 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 underscore. I circled D and wrote, mildly theatrical. What metaphor best represents your role in the current relationship dynamic? A. A bridge between lives. B. A bird released from its cage. C. A seedling seeking light. D. None of the above. I added my own option. E. A guy who paid for half of the Wi-Fi and still hasn't seen the new season of anything. She paused halfway through reading it. Then she opened her laptop and started typing something into a document titled Shared Closure Manifesto. I asked if there would be a commemorative mug. She said I was being uncooperative again. The next section was labeled Final Conversation Prompts. There were questions neither of us wanted to answer, but she read them anyway like she was auditioning for a job she already had. What have you learned from this partnership? I answered that some people will laminate anything. She asked me not to trivialize the process. I asked if the process included my air fryer, because it was still technically in her emotional deactivation zone. Then she got quiet. She closed the laptop. That was rare. When Pamela closed a laptop voluntarily, something was either about to be announced or filed in triplicate. She stood up, walked to the entry table, and brought out a box. A literal box. Gray. Glossy. With dividers. Inside were labeled envelopes. One said receipts. Another said memories. The third just said Stephen, miscellaneous. I opened mine. Inside was a brochure from the workshop, a printed screenshot of a text I'd once sent her in 2017. Bring milk, please, and a note that said, you were funny when it didn't feel like you were trying to win something. That one landed somewhere strange. Not painful. Not warm. Just targeted. I set the envelope down and asked if this meant we were officially post-phase. She nodded, calmly. Then added, we've been in post-phase since the storage unit. This is just narrative closure. Then she took out a second envelope. A special one. This one was marked Endgame. I didn't know whether to laugh or ask if there would be a closing credits sequence. Inside, a printed screenshot of a message thread. Not from me. From Jonathan. It wasn't romantic. Not exactly. It was operational. They were planning something called the Spring Pilot. There were notes. Color codes. A schedule. Phase breakdowns. It was dated 6 months before the flamingos. And underneath it all was a line from Pamela. I want to be out by June. We'll call it a conscious reset. I looked up. She didn't look ashamed. Or smug. She looked like someone who had already packed the metaphorical suitcase and was just waiting for the Uber of personal growth to arrive. I didn't cheat, she said, flatly. Not in the conventional sense. I nodded. You just gradually transferred the lease to someone else. He understands my frameworks. He understands your frameworks, I repeated, slowly. She added, he respects the intentionality of my process. So he lets you finish your own sentences. She didn't argue. She stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured herself exactly 6 ounces of cucumber water. I stayed seated. She came back, slid me one last document. Separation Blueprint Beta. Under the heading was a checklist. Emotional inventory complete. Roles reassigned respectfully. Legacy conflicts neutralized. Humor recontextualized. Thank you ceremony pending. I asked if the ceremony included music. She replied, just a reading of our impact statements. I looked at the list, then at her. Then I picked up the envelope labeled Stephen, miscellaneous, took out the milk text, and slid it across the table. If you find someone who sends texts like that, I said, you hang on to them. She didn't smile. But she didn't erase it either. That night, I moved into the guest room. The whiteboard was still in there. So was the spreadsheet. And the sweatshirt from Jonathan, which she'd quietly folded and left on the bed. I took a pen, walked over to the whiteboard, and added one line under celebrations. Nobody died. The last week was mostly paperwork. Not legal paperwork. That would have been too straightforward. This was transitional experience mapping, intentional lifestyle rescoping, and a few laminated worksheets that had boxes labeled me before, me during, and me beyond. Pamela loved boxes. I, on the other hand, had moved on to making sarcastic annotations in the margins of every document she left on the dining table. The checklist for Final Emotional Clarity Roundtable had a note in my handwriting that said, "Bring snacks," underlined twice. She didn't laugh, but she also didn't erase it. That was about as close as we got a shared joy by then. Tuesday evening, she presented me with our exit survey. A 4-page form with instructions like circle the feeling that most applies, rate your grief in decibels, and a fill-in-the-blank prompt titled, "I knew it was over when." I wrote, "When we started rating our grief like it was part of a wine tasting." Pamela didn't react. She just slid me another pen, because apparently the color of ink we used represented our current stage of acceptance. She handed me blue. I took red. It felt more honest. We scheduled our final closure session for Saturday morning. Pamela insisted on a 9 a.m. start time. She said she wanted the lighting to be neutral. I said I'd be there if I didn't get distracted by a more compelling commitment like reorganizing the junk drawer. At exactly 8:59 a.m., I walked into the living room. She had arranged 2 chairs facing each other with a small table between them, as if we were about to roleplay as guests on a podcast neither of us had prepared for. On the table were 2 mugs labeled Stillness and Process. I took Process. It felt less smug. The first question she asked, without looking up from her note cards, was, "Do you feel heard?" I answered, "I can still hear myself, so that's something." She nodded like she was interviewing me for a documentary about men who used sarcasm as emotional armor. Then she asked the next one, "What are you choosing to release?" I looked around the room. Our bookshelf. The lamp I hated. The rug she claimed was conversation-provoking. I said, "This chair." Then sat in it harder. We went through the entire list. Most of it was the same sort of stuff she'd been quoting for weeks about honoring our shared path, reclaiming autonomy, realigning the definitions of success, all while pretending our shared internet history didn't include 5 years of half-watched crime documentaries and several hours of competitive pottery clips. Then she pulled out the impact statement. Hers was typed, double-spaced, with bullet points. She began reading. "You helped me become aware of my own patterns. You taught me that comfort can become camouflage. You reminded me that routines are not commitments." I asked if that was from her or if she had copy-pasted it from the back of a therapy workbook. She said that kind of comment was part of the reason she needed to reframe. I told her that being with her was like living in a motivational calendar that judged you back. Then she asked me for mine. I said I didn't write it down. She looked disappointed. Not because she expected a poem or anything, but because she didn't know how to file what I was about to say. "You took a relationship," I said, "and turned it into a case study. You made spreadsheets out of emotions and meetings out of memories. You didn't cheat, Pamela. Not with your body. But you outsourced us. You were in a beta test on moving out before you even told me you were bored." She looked down. "You started designing your next chapter while I was still fixing the thermostat." There was a long pause. She didn't deny it. She just said, "I didn't know how to stay." I nodded. "You knew how to plan a soft departure. You just forgot how to be in the thing you were leaving." We sat in silence for a while. Then she handed me a small stack of cards. Each one had a different question. If this experience were a movie, what genre would it be? I answered, "A really long indie film where nothing explodes and the ending is a shrug." "What's one thing you'll keep from this chapter?" I said, "My name." "What's one thing you're excited to forget?" I flipped the card upside down. Eventually, she stood, walked over to the bookshelf, took only 3 books, all nonfiction, left the fiction. I found that ironic. She didn't take the mugs, or the rug, or the chair I now hated more than the lamp. She walked to the door, holding a tote bag with a pin on it that said, "Live intentionally or not at all." She turned to me one last time and said, "You'll be okay." I said, "I've met me. I'll be weird for a while." And then she left. Not like she had escaped. Not like she had been forced. She left like someone walking out of a room they'd already mentally repainted. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. Instead, I sat in the rug's emotional grounding zone, opened the last envelope she had left behind on the table, and read the final message. "Thank you for participating in this process. Feedback welcome." I grabbed a pen, flipped it over, wrote, "Next time, maybe don't prototype your exit." Then I folded it, slipped it back inside, and placed it on her old chair. Not because I thought she'd come back for it, but because some things deserve an endnote. even if nobody reads it. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel